he actually did this one, which I thought was pretty funny. I actually pulled it up over here, and I was reading through the blog post because he casually reference it. It's like this weird off the wall, like homegrown site still using like standard HTML. So really basic. I kind of like basic sites too. And I've never even seen this. It's just Linux opinion about why Linux desktop isn't where it is. I actually read through this thing, and I gotta tell you, the article's not terrible. Like Brodie ripped it apart. He said it was the worst anti-Linux blog post, but I felt like there was some really good points made. You know, like Linux is mostly used for in the server space, which is true. That's why Linux is as big as it is and has so much development. He does get kind of sidetracked a bit through here. Not terribly wrong with like fragmentation. He calls it balkanization, which is a pretty aggressive term because that's saying there's competing factions of Linux like at war with each other. And that's not true. There's a lot of fragmentation, but I would not call it balkanization. That seems a little excessive. And as far as like competing flavors of Linux, they really don't compete. They all have like their own little bits. To me, Linux is Linux. It doesn't matter what you put me in. I don't even care if you put me on like an Ubuntu, whatever. I don't care. I'm going to strip it down and just kind of make it feel and look and operate kind of like how it's set up right here. So I'm like, no, competing window managers and different. So it all boils down to fragmentation from the look of a lot of his points. I look at it and I'm like, yeah, yeah, it's a little bit fragmented, but once you learn how to use it, it's not really that bad. It just works a lot differently. And as far as dependency chaos and standardized application, you got Flatpak, you have Nix, you have a lot of things that can go between all the distros. So less of a point, in my opinion, that fixes all the other like API changes, dependencies. A lot of that can be fixed with just simple separation of package managers, like I was talking about at the start of the stream. As far as credibility, no major company with staying power supports desktop Linux. Yeah, I mean, that's true, but that's more from a support standpoint. You can't support all the different flavors of Linux. So that's the problem. I don't think you get away from it. I wouldn't call it credibility. I would just say it's not supportable because of how vastly different everyone's configuration is from one to the next. That said, you got things like SteamOS that does a really good job of standardizing it and making it supported with millions of users. That's pretty darn good. So saying it's not credible is not true, I would say. And then Microsoft, this is pretty bad too. I get where he's going with the article, but Brodie's probably right for tearing this apart. I just have a little bit different take in my viewpoint. Like, PC vendors are not fearful of making Microsoft angry. They don't care. Like Lenovo and IBM and Dell and other people have always offered Linux flavor, or when they have offered it, like Lenovo did it for a little bit, and then they're like, this sucks. We're getting all these calls. People are like, hey, I ordered it. I need to switch this back. And they're like, it's not worth it. We're not making any money on it. Let's just switch back to Microsoft Windows. Everyone knows it. And it's a very calculated cost. And then people can install it themselves. And that way we don't get these weird support calls. So I get it. I really do. And conversion costs, yeah, this is kind of a sad point too. This one is a very valid point. A few companies and governments actually have done the conversion. I think the probably most infamous one was, I think the entire German government switched over to Linux and then used it for like 5 years or something, and then switched back to Microsoft. So they paid the conversion cost twice there. And that was kind of a sad day when they were like, okay, this Linux thing's just not working out for us from a desktop point of view. So that did happen, which was unfortunate. Missing applications, I'd say there's just application alternatives instead of missing. But gaming, Microsoft Office, Photoshop are the two, like the really big ones that most people miss. And then the free software culture. Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's a very vocal minority in Linux when it comes to like free software and open source that are just kind of weird, and they're, just not the most likable crew. Let's just say that. A lot of times they're very hostile. So especially if you talk down on Linux or that type of thing, and I typically piss them off all the time. So I usually get some hate mail from that. But yeah, I would say the free software culture is a little bit weird, to say the least. But I appreciate the weirdness of it, even though I didn't necessarily jive with me, because it exists, and I think some of their existence can be attributed to this weird crew. So, your Richard Stallmans and those types of, yeah, followers. I get it, man. I get it. And yeah, it's a weird crew, but at the same time, I'm kind of like, is it a necessary evil? Maybe. And no way forward. This was where it was like, what? They just went completely off the rails here at the end. It'll be irrelevant and abandoned by more developers. I don't think so. I think really I take a completely different future of Linux where the big dogs like your Microsoft, your Steam, your other people will figure out ways to leverage Linux in a way that benefits them, and they can take a lot of their workload over. Just look at like Valve's example of using the Steam Deck, and then uh, moving forward with that, you could take Google's example of using Chromebooks. That's all Linux based, and then making that whole hardware sphere available to schools, education, low end desktop users. They did such a good job. So I think the way forward for Linux is, one, they have the server space, which is amazing. It's booming. It's bigger than it ever has been. You have the desktop space, which is actually going forward pretty well with Steam and Chromebooks. And then you have the traditional desktop, which is more of your hobbyists and people that are passionate about having like their own, like myself. I would lump myself into this third category. And I just see it getting better. So kind of weird. Kind of a weird article. I'd say, I pretty much agree. It is probably the most anti-Linux article I've read in a while. But I mean, there were a couple little points here, but for the most part, kind of like, guy's a little bit off his rocker, but so be it. A little too abrasive. Yeah.